It means a great deal to me to be a member of the EPS, and so I'm particularly pleased to have been asked to deliver this Bartlett lecture, although I'm a bit sad that after all, it cannot be done face-to-face for real, and I'm making a recording instead in our home in Harrow. Bartlett, of course, was well known for promoting the kind of hardline experimental psychology that is still promoted to this day by the EPS. And when I was a student, like so many of us, I bought a copy of his book, Remembering. And this is in fact the title page of my copy. And you can see it cost me 10 shillings. When I looked at this again, I was surprised because I had not remembered that the subtitle is a study in experimental and social psychology. So what happened to the social psychology in the hardline experimental psychology that Bartlett promoted? Further investigation led me to understand that he was also a bit mystified about the lack of social psychology. And indeed, it's after an especially boring EPS meeting, he is alleged to have said to Artie Hermelin, "It's all gone wrong. I wish I had written novels instead." So why did social psychology get left out? One possibility is that in his endeavor to promote psychology as part of hardline natural sciences, he decided that social psychology was too difficult at that stage and must be omitted. But nevertheless, in his book, Remembering, at one point he does actually say, everything in psychology belongs to social psychology. But I doubt very much if I actually read Remembering when I was a student. What I was actually reading was Aldous Huxley's account of the effects of mescaline on subjective experience, where he quotes William Blake saying, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is. And in this copy of mine, I find that I have underlined passages like, this is how one ought to see how things really are. Another thing that Huxley mentions is certain of these changes, these hallucinations, are similar to those which occur in schizophrenia. Is the mental disorder due to a chemical disorder? And maybe it was this idea that led me to move into clinical psychology when I had finished my experimental psychology degree. And indeed, I spent a lot of my career studying schizophrenia, which is defined in terms of hallucinations, which are false perceptions, and delusions, which are false beliefs. Perhaps I wondered if schizophrenic patients were really seeing the world as it really was, though I think now that the answer is no. Here are some examples of these symptoms. Thought broadcasting. It was like my thoughts were shouted out. It seems to be both a hallucination and a delusion. Thought insertion. Thoughts come into my head like, kill God. It's just like my mind working, but it isn't. They come from this chap, Chris, they're his thoughts. And delusions of control. My fingers pick up the pen, but I don't control them. I was closely involved in some of the early studies suggesting that schizophrenia really was a chemical disorder. In the mid-70s, it had been found that the potency of the various antipsychotic drugs was closely correlated with their ability to block dopamine receptors. And inspired by this, I was involved in an experiment where we compared two versions of flupenthixol, which is, these are isomers in an alpha and a beta form, but the alpha flupenthixol blocks dopamine receptors, while the beta flupenthixol, although active, does not block dopamine receptors. And as you can see from this study, after a few weeks, the severity of hallucinations and delusions have been reduced by alpha flupenthixol, while beta flupenthixol is no different from placebo. Now, hallucinations and delusions are sometimes called positive symptoms. They're features that are abnormal by their presence, in contrast to things like agnosias, where features are abnormal by their absence from subjective experience. Positive symptoms concern changes in subjective experience, the contents of consciousness, rather than changes in behavior. So what kind of brain mechanisms can explain these interloping phenomena like hallucinations and delusions? And what can these symptoms tell us about mind-brain relationships? Explaining interloping phenomena is only difficult when we treat perception like photography, with perception determined solely by sensory input, in other words, a bottom-up process. And Bartlett, on many occasions, points out that even the most elementary looking perceptual processes can be shown to have the character of inferential construction. And of course, his book, Remembering, is about the constructive nature of memory. And this, of course, goes back to Helmholtz, who, roughly translated, said, we infer what is out there in the world on the basis of sensory evidence, bottom up, and prior expectations, top down. Here's a simple example of how this two-way process makes perceptual inferences possible. Here are two simple sentences. Jack and Jill went up the hill. The last event was cancelled. How do we read them? In the olden days, reading was thought to be a bottom-up process. You went from the shape, the graphic shape was converted to a letter, the letter to a word, the word to a sentence, and the sentence into meaning. But there is a problem with the two sentences I've shown you, which hopefully you haven't noticed yet, which is that the EV and W graphic symbol is absolutely identical. So how do you know whether the word is event or went? Bottom up, from the shape to the letter to the word, you would finish up in an ambiguous situation because you wouldn't know whether it was went or event. But top down, the word is constrained by the sentence, and the letters are constrained by the word, and the graphic shape is constrained by the letters. So the problem is resolved if we have a combination of bottom-up evidence and top-down expectations. And we have suggested, Paul Fletcher and I suggested that the mechanisms by which we make inferences from evidence applies both to beliefs, that is delusions, as well as perceptions, that is hallucinations. So we need to consider the mechanisms of top-down control which are involved in these inferential processes. And the main theme of my presentation is to do with precision control. That is to say, we have to take into account the relative precision of the evidence and the precision of the priors. And this has a key role in our perceptions and our beliefs. So here's an example very much based on Phil Corlett's work, which you heard about earlier, of how evidence and prior beliefs can influence what we see and what we believe. So here we see a very kind man passing a hairdryer to his wife, who was saying, honey, hand me the hairdryer. And the evidence, as we see here, there's a hairdryer. And this is the Bayesian version of how this might work. We have the evidence that it's a hairdryer. We have a prior expectation, which is relatively neutral about whether it's a hairdryer or a gun. And so our perception and our belief is that it is indeed a hairdryer. But what happens if you're paranoid? Yeah, the evidence is the same, but we have this very strong prior expectation that it's a gun. And as a result, our perception and our belief is that it's not a hairdryer, but it's a gun. And then, of course, we can have the opposite situation where it really is a gun, but you're so trusting that your prior expectation is so strong that it's a hairdryer that what you perceive is that it's a hairdryer. And I've hinted here at the mechanism of top-down control and the importance of precision weighting. And this is the example of how this works when we have to combine evidence from different modalities. Greater weight is given to the signal with the higher precision, as we see in the example here. So in this experiment from Ernst and Banks, people were having to judge the thickness of a bar both by vision and by touch. In the normal case, the precision of the vision is much greater than the precision of the touch. And so the experience, the perception is dominated by vision, as we see here. But as you increase the noise in the visual signal, its precision reduces, and you reach a point here where the noise in this vision is so high that it's entirely dominated by touch. There's an interesting intermediate stage where combining the two on the basis of their precision, you can actually do better than either modality on its own. So this is how precision control works. But what happens in the interesting situation if we want to attend to a less salient stimulus, for example, touch? And to do this, we can actually alter our prior belief about the precision estimates. We no longer use the actual precision estimates. We alter them to a belief about the precision estimates, and we behave as if the attended channel has higher precision than it really does. So here's an example where we have no goal, the touch is noisier than the vision, so we attend to vision. Here's the same situation, we have no goal, but now the precision of the touch is much greater than the vision, so we attend to touch. And in the interesting case where we have the goal of attending to touch, these are the actual precisions, as in the original case, but we behave as if they had this kind of precision, and this enables us to tend to the touch, which is what we have been instructed to do. Now, hallucinations and delusions are positive symptoms, that is, features that are abnormal by their presence. And I'm suggesting here that such features can be related to the constructive process, such as precision control, underlying perception and belief. So we can see how patients might come to have these strange experiences. But why do these symptoms concern changes in subjective experience, that is the contents of consciousness, rather than just changes in behavior? In the example I showed you of combining sensory modalities such as touch and vision, I don't think consciousness needs to be involved. So before I get back to schizophrenia, I need to address the problem of consciousness. Now, I was very much influenced by this paper by Tim Challis, published in 1972, at a time before Crick and Koch, when scientists supposedly were not studying consciousness. This, of course, is nonsense. And Tim describes a function of consciousness which is very much to do with top-down control. This is what he said. The brain is a set of relatively independent systems whose operations are coordinated at any moment by the selector input to the dominant action system. The selector input selects which action system is to be dominant, sets the goal of the action system, and is itself preserved in memory. And it's suggested that this input corresponds to the concept of consciousness. I think this description is rather close to descriptions of working memory, and which many people have said that the working memory is the contents of consciousness corresponds to the contents of working memory. The global broadcasting theory of consciousness suggests that consciousness depends on the bringing into consciousness various information from selected subsystems. And Nick Shea and I have suggested that explicit metacognition is another aspect of consciousness where information is produced in a form that can be expressed and shared with others. Here we see the classic drawing of Challis's supervisory attentional system, where we have the supervisory system monitoring the unconscious processes in which various perception action systems are competing with each other. Of course, there is a missing arrow in this diagram because in order to monitor it, there must be information coming up from the unconscious system into the supervisory attentional system. So now I want to consider, how does the conscious level monitor and control the unconscious level? So here's an example taken from the work with Nick Shea and others about explicit metacognition. And this is essentially a reworking of Tim Challis's model, except now that it's in color. And we have shown that there is actually an unconscious supervisory system operating, for example, taking into account the precision of these various competing sensory inputs. But at the conscious level, signals about lower level function emerge, and from the conscious level, the underlying processes are modified. And here are some examples of signals about the lower level function. These would include things like perceptual fluency, action fluency, and confidence about our decisions. And of course, strategies for modifying lower level function would include attending to particular stimuli, exploring rather than exploiting old information, and slowing down when the errors become too great. So now I want to talk a little bit about this explicit metacognition. Of course, precision control is applied at all levels of the control system, but precision becomes particularly difficult to estimate at the highest level. And this is showing some work I did with Daniel Yon, though actually he did the work basically. As we go up the hierarchy, precision decreases and becomes more difficult to estimate. And we're showing here 3 levels, what I call the model-free level, which is unconscious and where simply sensations are turned into actions by these automatic processes. A model-based level where we actually have values and decisions, and a meta level where we're actually asking how good is our model of the world. And as we go up this hierarchy, I've illustrated that the noise becomes greater, the precision becomes less. And there are 2 reasons for this. First of all, you're combining information from many noisy sources, and in certain circumstances, this increases the noise rather than decreasing it, so precision becomes less. And secondly, at the higher levels, there's not enough data. In other words, there's not enough experience, past experience, to properly characterize the distributions. We can no longer use simple Gaussians. And here's another example from my work with Nick Shea, essentially showing the same thing. Here we have 2 of these lower level systems, one concerned with reaching and grasping, the other concerned with social cognition. The information from these 2 systems has to be combined in the global workspace. And this involves making quick and dirty approximations to avoid the computational problems of not being able to characterize the precision distributions. In the example here, we have the situation where there is only 1 biscuit left on the plate. The reaching and grasping system has worked out the optimum way to reach this last biscuit, but the social cognition system has worked out whether this is socially appropriate in the context. And these 2 systems have to be combined in order to produce the appropriate action. Now, these explicit metacognitions are, as a result of the low precision and the lack of experience, they've often been described, or Metzinger has described them as being thin and evasive. These are things like confidence and fluency. And because they are thin and evasive, we do not always interpret them correctly. So here is an example with perceptual fluency. This is the ease and speed with which we perceive things. And this is a feeling which we can certainly report to others, but this is a feeling we don't always interpret correctly. So this is a classic experiment from Kunst, Wilson, and Zients from Science in 1980. So the participants were shown a sequence of stimuli, which were actually irregular octagons, and they were shown a great many very briefly, one after another. And they were then showed old and new pairs, and they were asked 2 questions. Which of the pair had they seen before, and which did they prefer? And now they had all the time in the world to make their decision. And what you can see from the graph, which, as was common in those days, has no error bars, is that in terms of memory, they were actually at chance. They couldn't tell you which one they had seen before. But in terms of which one they preferred, they were considerably different from chance, and they typically preferred the shape they had seen before. In other words, the information about whether they had seen it before was there, but it was misinterpreted as liking rather than familiarity. And subsequent work has replicated this result and also shown that it is indeed driven by perceptual fluency. The perceptual fluency determines whether you like it or not. And this, of course, is actually to do with created by having seen them before. And you get similar things, aspects of misinterpretation of these metacognitive signals in the action system. So action selection fluency is another signal that can be misinterpreted. When our action selection is fluent, we feel that we are in control. This is reasonable since practice makes our actions more fluent and more accurate. But the link between our feeling of fluency and our competence can be broken through priming or TMS in the studies I've given below. So the feeling of fluency no longer reflects accuracy and control. So these metacognitive signals are difficult to estimate in terms of precision and in terms of their implications for behavior. But is this a disadvantage? Confidence is another metacognitive feeling that is not always an accurate marker of ability. But it is sometimes, as you will have learned from Dan Bang's talk this afternoon, useful to express confidence which deviates from the actual appropriate level of confidence that you should have. So deviant public expressions of confidence can have advantages. This occurs both when cooperating in joint decisions, we have to align our confidences, and also when competing to be chosen as an advisor, where it sometimes pays you to be overconfident. And another aspect of metacognitive feelings is that they are typically prediction errors. They reflect uncertainty. A lack of fluency is uncertainty. Confidence or lack of confidence is an example of uncertainty. And again, should we always respond to prediction errors? Prediction errors can sometimes be uninformative. We should not respond to them, and therefore we need to apply precision control to stop us responding to them. So this is another advantage for the imprecision of metacognitive feelings. So here's an example of where prediction errors should be ignored. And this is from Jean Donizet's lab in Paris. So the subjects are performing a simple hide and seek task. You have to decide, is your opponent hiding behind the tree or behind the wall? You choose the tree, and then you're told that they were indeed hiding behind the tree, so you were correct. Now, in this example, the opponent is extremely simple. He hides behind the tree 80% of the time, but otherwise is random. So we can learn to expect that he will hide behind the tree. Occasionally, of course, he will be behind the wall, creating a prediction error. And a model-free learner would update action values because of these prediction errors. But in this case, this is just random noise, and the prediction error should be ignored. But to do this, the learner has to believe that the prediction errors are noise. And this would be the case when you start looking at reversal learning. So here we have a typical reversal situation. They're hiding behind the tree 80% of the time, your opponent, and then it suddenly reverses and they're now hiding behind the wall 80% of the time. And this reversal happens a great many times, but not you're never told in advance when it's going to happen. So after several reversals, a model-based learner will know that the opponent can be in two states, either behind the tree or behind the wall. So if we're confident he's in the tree hiding state, we will downweight the prediction errors, that is in this case, as just noise. But if we think his state might be changing, we update our belief about the prediction errors because it's now a signal indicating change. So this is a situation when we believe that the prediction errors are noise, there's a low precision for the prediction errors and they're ignored. When we believe that the state might be changing, our prior belief prediction error has low precision, it's downweighted, and the prediction error is from the behavior of the opponent is upweighted, and our belief is updated on the basis of the prediction errors. The problem, of course, is that precision control of this kind can be difficult to apply because prior beliefs at the top of the hierarchy can be very sticky. We stick with them even against the evidence. So here's the complete experiment from Jean Donizet's lab. We're doing the hide and seek task, but in two situations. In one case, the subjects are told that your opponent is a person who may or may not be hiding behind the tree. In the other case, they're told that the opponent is a robot or actually a one-armed bandit. Of course, the task is exactly the same, and the actual agent they're playing against is a highly sophisticated artificial intelligence agent, which can adopt various more or less sophisticated strategies, varying from randomly biased, predicting, working out the value of going behind, looking behind the tree or going behind the tree or behind the wall, working out what the opponent thinks you're going to do, and working out what your opponent thinks you're going to do. These are examples of recursion. This is one level of theory of mind. This is two levels of theory of mind. Now we have the prior belief that robots are primitive, model-free learners at best, while people will try to predict what their opponent thinks they're going to do next. In other words, Tom level 2. And what the experiment shows is that people fail to abandon their prior belief about robot behavior despite the evidence. So if they're playing against a person, which is the blue bars, they can beat the opponent until it becomes so sophisticated that it's functioning at 2 level Tom. But when they think they're playing against a robot, they're actually beaten if the robot adopts these sophisticated strategies. They carry on behaving as if the robot is a model-free learner at best and do not respond to the evidence, at least across the 60 trials of this experiment. And here's more evidence that prior beliefs at the top can be very sticky and that evidence is down-weighted relative to prior belief. So some very early pet experiments, one of which I was involved with, people activate this mentalizing area in the prefrontal cortex when they believe they're playing against a person rather than a computer, even though the behavior of the opponent is exactly the same. And observing movements interferes with our own movements, but this depends on the belief that the mover is a person and not on the nature of the movements. So robotic movements will interfere if you think the mover is a person. This comes from Chris Miles' lab. Now, the symptoms of schizophrenia emerge from the highest level of the hierarchy because they're conscious experiences. So the stickiness of the priors at this metacognitive level is again revealed by the resistance of delusions to the presentation of counter evidence. But there's another feature of these symptoms that we must consider. They are intensely social in nature. This is the last thing I want to talk about. It is other people who are hearing my thoughts, controlling my actions, and working against me. So I now want to think about where is the top in top-down processes. And this goes back to work I did with Andreas Ropsdorf. This top is often outside the brain. The top of the hierarchy is where we engage with other people, and culture for that matter. We attend to a less salient stimulus because the experimenter tells us to. We believe we are playing against a person because the experiment tells us so. In fact, it's our interaction with other people that change the priors at the top of the hierarchy and exert precision control, and this overcomes their stickiness. So here's a toy example of this hierarchy of control, which is very loosely based on Carl Friston's model of how the brain works. So in the middle, we have the self, and at the bottom, the self is interacting with the physical world, pressing keys and seeing the result on a screen, and you can make mistakes. You can press the wrong key, and so we know that we've made the wrong action at some level, and the error is detected, and the strategy is to slow down. At the middle of the hierarchy, we're producing the wrong word, which requires a higher level of control. Again, we see the error, it's the wrong word, and in order to overcome this, we have to concentrate more on what we're doing. But at the top of the hierarchy, we're now interacting with the outside world. And this is a toy example of an attempt to publish a paper called The Social Brain, allowing humans to boldly go where no other species has been before. And the editor enforces the cultural convention that you're not allowed to split infinitives. We are told about the error, and we're told that we must conform with cultural conventions. And I'm pleased to say, in this case, the editor's objections were overcome. And this is again the example from the work I did with Nick Shea, Dan Bang, and Cecilia Hayes and others, talking about how these metacognitive representations are critically involved in interactions and in cultural transmission. So there are two things, according to Dan Sperber, that we need for cultural to explain culture. One is that we have to make a mental representation public. And this is these things coming from the unconscious into the conscious in a form that we can talk about to others. And secondly, we have to internalize a mental version of a public representation. So these are the down arrows, which, having discovered what culture wants us to do, we have to adjust the way our unconscious processes actually function. And we suggested that explicit metacognition embodies these two processes. So these interactions at the top create cultural powers. And I want to give you now a nice example of experiment designed to discover a cultural prior. And this is a chain of reproductions. So the first person is shown a picture and they have to reproduce it from memory. So they have the evidence and vision, they have their prior, which is cultural, and the reproduction will necessarily be closer to the prior. Now, if there is a cultural prior shared by many people, then each time this is reproduced, it will move closer to the prior. So the next person is shown the previous person's reproduction, they reproduce it and they will get closer to the prior. And the end of the sequence will reveal the cultural prior. And this, of course, is the famous experiment by Bartlett, which starts off with an Egyptian hieroglyph and finishes up as a cat, a very well-known cultural prior. And it's interesting that he has a footnote to this where he says, interesting to note that in another series from the same starting point, this design again developed into a cat by the time the 17th reproduction is reached. Now I want to give you some examples of precision control being exerted by other people. First of all, there's playing a trust game. This is a game where you have to discover by investing money in someone whether they're trustworthy or untrustworthy. If they invest the money and give you it back, they're trustworthy. If they take the money and run, they're not trustworthy. And of course, you can learn this through direct interaction. And each time you have an prior belief about their trustworthiness. If they take the money and run, that's a prediction error and the trustworthiness goes down. If they give you back more than you expect, it's a prediction error and the trustworthiness goes up. And you can actually see these prediction errors reflected in brain processes in the caudate nucleus. But what is interesting is if you tell people in advance how trustworthy their partner is, they continue to rely on this prior information, even when their own experience would cast doubt on its accuracy. And this is shown in behavioral studies from Belinsky's lab, and also in a couple of brain imaging studies using effectively the same technique, where you can see when there's no prior, you get these big prediction errors in the caudates, but when there is prior information, the prediction errors disappear. So instructions from others overcomes the stickiness of the priors at the top. And effectively what this is saying is, whereas we don't have enough information from our own personal experience to have a good estimation of what these priors should be, other people, and indeed culture more generally, has a vast amount of experience which has all been put together. And this enables us to get much better estimates of what our priors should be. Now I want to give one example of an explicit metacognition that comes to form a cultural prior. And in this case, I'm very much suggesting that this is an example of a cognitive gadget of the type that Celia Hayes talked about earlier. And I suggest that one such cultural prior is the belief in free will. So this belief is associated with the feeling of being in control, I am the cause of this event, and the feeling of regret, I could have done otherwise. And this goes right back to Epicurus, who also suggests that this sense of agency that you get from being in control and having been able to do otherwise is the basis for moral responsibility. People are held responsible for their actions that they have because of their free will. But there are interesting data today about what happens if you weaken people's belief in free will. And this is done by suggesting that authoritative statements from people like Francis Crick, such as most rational people now recognize that free will is an illusion. If people believe this, it actually changes their behavior. There's an increase in antisocial tendencies such as cheating. There's a reduction in helping and an increase in aggression, and a reduction in self-control. And the example I'm most impressed by is this study from Marcel Bra's lab, showing that if people believe that there is no such thing as free will, post-error slowing is reduced. So post-error slowing, of course, is a phenomenon discovered by Pat Rabbit in '66, whereby after you have made an error in a reaction time task, your next response is slowed down. And what Rigoni and colleagues showed that after you've believed that there's no such thing as free will, this slowing down ceases to happen. And I want to suggest that this post-error slowing, well, obviously this post-error slowing depends on top-down monitoring and control. So weakening our belief in free will weakens our belief in the utility of applying top-down control. And having free will relates to the belief that through top-down control, we can overcome our selfish urges. So without free will, our selfish urges can run free. So let me give you some suggestions of how this would actually work. This is precision control applied now to control, and particularly in relation to the weakened belief in free will. So first of all, there's a cost-benefit analysis. We have to decide, does top-down control have value or not? And if we don't believe in free will, we presume it has little value. Here is a well-practiced task. The value of monitoring is low, the effort of monitoring is high, so that you choose not to monitor it, you'll do well. With a novel task, the effort of monitoring is the same, but the value of monitoring is higher and more precise, so monitoring is needed. In the case of weakened belief in free will, although the effort of monitoring is lower than the value of monitoring and we ought to be using it, we top-down modification of these precision estimates reverts to the idea that the effort of monitoring is high and the value of monitoring is low, so no monitoring is applied. What about the beliefs about altruism and that our social urges are released? Here is a highly schematized diagram of the false default state in relation to our actions. And I'm presenting a sort of action space analogous to the perceptual quality space that Hack-Wan Lau talked about. And like his perceptual quality space, this action space is also structured by culture. So at one extreme, we have selfish actions, and at the other extreme, we have altruistic actions, and there are many other dimensions, which I have not labeled. And top-down control magnifies shows whereabouts in this action space you want to be. But your cultural beliefs about altruism is that there's much more space devoted to selfish behavior and a rather small amount of space devoted to altruistic behavior, and that top-down control is needed to keep you in this altruistic state. And I'm suggesting that this doesn't correspond to what's actually happening at lower levels. So when we have a weakened belief in free will, we are no longer able to apply the top-down control that keeps us in the altruistic phase, and we finish up in the selfish phase and behave accordingly. Although, ironically, I'm suggesting that to do this, to some extent, we are actually applying top-down control. So to conclude, explicit metacognition lies at the top of a hierarchy of control. Metacognitive feelings are thin and evasive, and their precision is difficult to compute. As a result, estimates of precision can be flexibly manipulated. And it's our interaction with other people that change the priors at the top of the hierarchy and exert precision control at this level. And mechanisms of top-down control at this level are shaped by our culture. What about schizophrenia? The positive symptoms of schizophrenia reflect failures in precision control at the top of the hierarchy. Creative processes run free. We're unable to filter out noise at the bottom of the hierarchy. And high-level priors remain sticky and are not modified by the other people and their culture. One of the problems for psychiatrists is to decide whether a bizarre belief is a psychotic symptom or just something resulting from a different culture. And typically their decision is that culturally transmitted bizarre beliefs are not considered to be psychotic symptoms. Now, to go back to Bartlett. Bartlett, as I said, was very interested in social psychology and indeed had a background relating to anthropology, and therefore was very interested in the effects of culture. And he says, yet however much agreement there may be as to the fact of social constructiveness, we know almost nothing of its exact mechanism. These all constitute important sociological and psychological problems which will provide a greater field for future research. So I believe I have presented some speculations about the mechanisms of social constructiveness, but obviously there's much more work to be done. In particular, what are the brain mechanisms underlying high-level precision control? And maybe the answer to this question may throw some more light on the nature of schizophrenia. So hopefully Bartlett might have quite liked this approach that I have given in the lecture named in his honor. But on the other hand, I think he would probably not approve of our attempt to explain social cognition in the form of a graphic novel. Thank you. And you can, if you look carefully, you will note that I have carefully put up a pre-publication version of the graphic novel on one side of me, and of Steve Fleming's wonderful book about metacognition on the other side of me.